Now we invite Leah to talk about the messiness of, dealing with this ecological and social mitigation of hydropower. And we are, in this parallel session, we are moving kind of away from Europe to developing country and look at all these different geographies and system and how it kind of can enrich our understanding. Thank you.
So hi everyone, thanks for being here for this small session on international hydropower. So I'm Leah Bêche from EDF, Electricity of France, and I'm at the Hydropower Engineering Center based near Chambéry. So I'm going to be talking about ecological and social mitigation, talking a little bit about social here, in developing countries. So I'm going to challenge a little bit these things that I know. I'm an ecologist, just to let you know that. I'd like to say that impacts of hydropower are known and they're universal, no matter where we are in the world. Meaning that upstream, we have water quality impacts, habitat loss, blocked migration, we know that. We can also downstream have reduced flows, impacts on water quality, sediment transport, blocked migration again. When we talk about hydropower development, we often don't talk about the ancillary facilities like transmission lines, access roads, and that can lead to deforestation and habitat loss. Talking about terrestrial biodiversity, the presence of hydropower development can reduce ecological connectivity, as we talked about in the plenary session about reindeer. And cumulative impacts of hydropower are also known that, when we talked about that in a few of the plenary discussions about where we cite hydropower has a big impact on cumulative impacts regarding fragmentation and whatnot. And these impacts are universal no matter where we are. So today I want to talk about a little bit of what Donald Rumsfeld said were the known unknowns, and maybe a little bit about the unknown unknowns, which are the known unknowns are the things that we know we don't know. So we know we're dealing with uncertainty. We know that it's there. And the unknown unknowns are basically the surprises. So when we're dealing with hydropower in developing countries, we're dealing with somewhat unique challenges, somewhat because they're things that we deal with even in hydropower, and we're talking about it a lot here, even in countries that have been doing it for over 100 years. But we're diving a little bit more into the unknown. We are dealing with new species that haven't been described. They're unstudied or understudied ecology. And we need to, more than we're used to, I'd say, in Europe or North America, we need to integrate the social dimension, which is often the forgotten part of ecological mitigation. So a little quiz for those of you who are ecologists in the room, or maybe not. How many freshwater species do you think there are in the world? So quick, get a number in your head. Okay, about 18,000, so give or take. And that represents about 10% of all species and a third of all vertebrate species that live in freshwater. So that's a lot, given the small surface area that freshwater represents on land. And in South America, a study from almost 20 years ago now said that a new fish species is described every 4 days. And that is actually incredible because we talked about, new diversity. We often think about, it's the bacteria, it's the myofauna. Here we're talking about fish species. So that's insane. 465 new freshwater species described in 5 years between 2001 and 2006. And it's ongoing. So that presents, obviously, unique challenges for hydropower developing in those countries. The hydropower pipeline is being developed in these countries, which are also biodiversity hotspots. And that creates incredible potential conflicts between hydropower production and impacts on terrestrial and aquatic biodiversity. Because we're dealing with these areas, the hotspots are unique concentrations of biodiversity. So how do we deal with that? So the challenge that we have in these situations, in these hotspots, is that mitigation and increased understanding of these areas, of these hotspots, are advancing in parallel. We can't wait to know more to build the electricity that people need. So we've been talking about that most people in the developing countries don't have access to electricity. Hydropower is often the only solution, the only viable solution in many places. And even when it's not the only solution, it's necessary to deal with integrating solar or wind in those countries. So we're dealing with unknown biodiversity, we're dealing with areas with very high endemism, and we're dealing with complexity. So complexity here is a very simplified schema of fish migration in the Amazon, way more complex than we're used to with salmonids, for example. And this is simplified. So how do we deal with this level of complexity when we don't know what even the species that we're dealing with? So when we work on projects in these developing countries, we have to do studies on species description, basic things, migration studies, where are the fish going, what are they doing, their distribution, their habitat use. And in many cases, when there's no project, there's no studies. Why is it that we don't know what's going on in these countries, in these areas? It's because they've been understudied. Nobody has taken the time and the money to invest in the science. So I said earlier that the mitigation, that the impacts are known. And the mitigation is also known. I mean, saying the mitigation principles that we use here in Norway or that we use in France are the same that we use in a developing country. It's just that we need to adapt them a little bit to the local site. So we always start with avoiding, and that's project siting. We reduce, and we have all the typical mitigation measures for reducing. We restore with site rehabilitation. And then if whatever we can't avoid, reduce, restore, we offset. So these are some of the examples of projects that we've been involved with at EDF of mitigation that's been, from the reducing reservoir size to putting aeration weirs for water quality to rehabilitation with local plants after construction. And I'd say that we have a certain amount of knowledge to be able to do standard mitigation. So they're the principles that are independent of place, meaning that wherever we decide to put a siting, for example, of a project has an influence on its impacts. That is universal situation. The reservoir level, the lower it is, generally the better it is in terms of impacts. The water intake level also has an impact on downstream water quality. Those things are kind of universal, and they're all elements of the design. The design of the project influences its impact, and those are standard mitigation things. Afterwards, we have specific mitigation measures where we need to have more knowledge, and it's generally more complicated to put in place without that ecological knowledge. That could be things like fish passage, for example. If we don't know what the fish are doing in their migration patterns, we can't design fish passes. And developing reservoir fisheries, or even site rehabilitation. But the important thing here is that many of these mitigation measures are part of the design of the project itself. They're not after-the-fact things. And that's important because of timing. Because most mitigation happens in the pre-screening and the design scoping phases, pre-feasibility phases of the project. Meaning that that's when the engineers are working to say where we're going to put the project, how is it going to be designed, how many megawatts, how many turbines, what reservoir level, et cetera. Is it going to have a fish pass or not? If we wait until we do the ESHA, so the ESHA is the Environmental Social Impact Assessment, it's too late. Because they're already decided those main things. Where's the project? How is it going to operate, et cetera. So we need to be present with information to be able to influence these design elements early on. That's even more important when we're dealing with these situations because these are new projects. They're not existing projects. So then I wanted to enter into the social dimension a little bit because we've been talking about the ecological uncertainty. But when we're dealing with the development of hydro in these countries, there is an extraordinarily strong dependence on the local environment that in some ways we've lost in many places in Europe and North America, where we become disconnected from our own environment and the reliance on ecosystem services and even the spirituality related to the local environment. And so all of the mitigation and the offsets must integrate people. And that's through engagement, inclusion, the engagement meaning talking to the people, including them in the decision-making process, getting the social license to operate, so that's acceptance of the project, but earning that trust, not taking it. Involving them in the governance and in the stewardship of their environment after the project. So basically, ecological mitigation is easy. So that's a little controversial thing to say, because we're here talking about for days how complicated it is, all the things we don't know, and I agree, I'm an ecologist, there are a lot of things we don't know. But basically the principles of how we can mitigate are known. That's what I've been saying, and this is an example with, for example, the IFC Performance Standard 6 principles for offsetting. So basically, how do we get no net loss, how do we quantify gains and losses, etc. That's part of our ecological principles, and they're known. We know how to go about it, even if there's debates all over the place about what exactly we should be doing. However, some of the principles, like getting the compensation, the offsetting on the ground and making it long-term, lead us into the social and the societal dimension. And we need people, we actually need people to restore and protect the biodiversity, otherwise it won't happen. So an example here with a project that I'm working on in Cameroon, where the long-term viability of an offset, so after we've reduced all the impacts that we could, is completely reliant on creating viable alternatives for people. So we have here the Mpemejim National Park, where we have offsetting for our hydropower project via averted loss, protection, and restoration of that habitat. And all of that is relying on reducing poaching, reducing deforestation, creating riparian buffer zones from cocoa production. And we can't do that if we don't involve the people and if we don't create livelihood improvement for them, because they won't accept it and it won't respect the long-term durability of the offset. So it looks good on paper, but without the people, we go nowhere. So my presentation is basically saying that we need more integration. So ENS, I mentioned, environmental and social, embarked in the design team. That's the only way to get the mitigation done in the early phases. If we wait for the ISHA, it's too late. Ecology needs more sociology. I don't think there's that many social people here, but humans are a part of their environment, and we can talk about untouched nature, but when we're going in doing offsetting, it's often restoring habitats. When we go and build a project, there are often people already there. We need to work with them because mitigation can't be done in a silo, and we need to be able to demonstrate the long-term viability. And then we need more integration between researchers and developers. So I kind of felt in the plenary that sometimes there was this tension between the research world and the developers world, and some people were saying, no, we need to work together. And I fully adhere to that the projects, developers, they need research to be able to develop and monitor the mitigation and show that they're doing things responsibly. At the same time, the projects provide immense opportunities to improve biodiversity knowledge and future mitigation so that it's better for everyone. And I know that in the projects that we're working on here, this is an example, we've been using eDNA to assess Amazon fish biodiversity. So we're building up the eDNA bank for these fish species. We're working on fish species description, on their migration patterns, on all of these elements that are contributing to overall increased biodiversity knowledge and management for future hydro projects, because we're probably not the only ones that are working in these areas. So with that, just want to say thank you. Available for questions.